Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Combo Couch. I am Fiorella Isabel. And today I am delighted to have with me two wonderful people that have a wonderful way of covering this particular issue on Russia Ukraine that we're going to discuss today. We have geopolitical analyst Brian Berletic, who is, of course, of the New Atlas on YouTube. And then we have Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist extraordinaire, has a Substack and also does videos on UK Column. You should definitely check those out as well. So welcome to the both of you. Thank you for coming on and discussing this with me, because this is a subject that everybody's just been sort of like stuck on, the way things happen. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
No, thanks for having us.
Well, I thought of you both because I wanted to get your perspective, because as I said, what happened with Prigozhin, I don't think the saga is over. And there have been some recent developments. So apart from what I'm sure we've all discussed ad nauseum with what happened and the called mutiny by Russia, where Prigozhin said he was going to come in with thousands of his men into Moscow, and he proceeded to do so. A lot of people went online that day and started spreading actual wrong information to try to sensationalize everything that was happening. We know that the Western media fell flat on their face, wishing for a Russian civil war and saying Putin would be removed, when we know this was really not about Putin as much as Prigozhin had been for months talking about his issues with the Russian Ministry of Defense and Shoigu and other members. So there was a lot of background on that. And I think this has been covered, where, you know, he had been talking about the Donbass and saying that Ukrainians hadn't been actually killing Russians. He had been very critical. So when this happened, there were two camps that existed. There was the camp that said this was a 5D chess move by Vladimir Putin, or members that were really high up, to try to make some advancements for Russia. And they're also now saying that what is the movement of Wagner into Belarus is proof of that, and that Putin would never allow him to live, Prigozhin, if he was really a threat. And there was just so much murkiness in this whole thing. Then there was the other camp that said everything happened as we were told. Everything that we were told by the Russian government was entirely accurate, and there's nothing to look at. I tend to fall somewhere in the middle. I definitely don't think that this is some sort of 5D chess move, for various reasons I'll discuss. But I wanted to get your take first of all. So I'll start with you, Brian. Give me your take as what you think happened, and how, you know, do you see this, how this actually came about?
I think the transition that Wagner was making from the private military company that it had been for so many years to this fighting force that it had become in Ukraine, in the special military operation, I think it was having a difficult time making that transition. And more specifically for Prigozhin, I think he was having a problem making this transition. And he had these problems with the Ministry of Defense, and he was exhibiting behavior that, if for any other military commander, would be seen as insubordination and would not be tolerated. And I think it was because of his background and his relationship with the Russian government that this was tolerated to a point. And I believe that because it was not dealt with completely and in a very final way, it opened the door for Prigozhin to continue to escalate. And I think that's what that last move of his was Prigozhin overplaying his hand. I don't think he thought it through very well. When he did do it, it was not a serious coup attempt. As I explained at the time, the logistics of trying to take over Russia with this handful of fighters, not even the majority of Wagner's fighters, just some fighters that went with him, maybe 2,000 or 3,000. Some people say maybe 5,000 to 8,000. You cannot take over Russia with a force like this, especially when it's dependent entirely on the Ministry of Defense for its ammunition and equipment and fuel, food, and absolutely everything else. So he expected someone in the higher levels of government and in the military to side with him, and they didn't. I bet he thought perhaps President Putin would side with him, but obviously before even lunchtime, President Putin made his speech, and he settled it without question. It was settled, and it was just a matter of, as Alex Cristoforo from the Duran said, that they were on this road trip to Moscow, and they had a lot of time to think about what a bad idea this all was. And luckily, they gave up before there was more carnage, more violence, more loss of life. And so I honestly think that is what was going on. Yes, they're moving to Belarus, but to do what? Even if the entire Wagner force moved to Belarus, that is not a force that could, say, take Kiev. Of course, it could enter battle and do something on the other side of the border, but it's not going to take Kiev. It's not going to significantly threaten any major military formation in Ukraine on that side of the border. So I don't know what the big 5D chess move would be, even if all of Wagner's forces were sent there. But not all of their forces are sent there. Most of Wagner's forces are being folded into the Ministry of Defense.
Vanessa, I want to hear from you, because it's funny you mentioned that, Brian, because there are people here saying actually most of Wagner forces are not being funneled into the Ministry of Defense, and I'm just like, really? Because I thought it was the other. I agree with you. I thought it was that. So it's really interesting to hear these theories online. Vanessa, what did you think when all of this was happening, and how do you view it?
Well, I think for me, what was so interesting and what led me to think that Moscow was certainly aware that there was potential for something like this and that it would be a major distraction is the timing of the Syrian Arab Army buildup in the north and north of Aleppo and towards the northeast, literally a few days before the whole Prigozhin affair. And actually, if you look at the military strategy during that time, so there was a buildup by one of the Republican Guard divisions. So that means, you know, the movement of huge numbers of armored vehicles, tanks, artillery stations, and so on, to the north of Syria and taking up positions in some very sensitive areas, bordering on Idlib, bordering with the Turkish proxy forces in the north, and even touching on, of course, the northeast, controlled by the states with their Kurdish and ISIS proxies. And then literally, when the Prigozhin affair kicked off, suddenly Russia started, almost split-second timing, started one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in Idlib. Now, you can argue, okay, they saw the Prigozhin thing was happening, so they decided to take advantage of the media attention being drawn away. You can also potentially argue that they had some inkling that Prigozhin was going to go off the deep end, and they decided to capitalize on that in Syria, for example, right? I don't know if people actually remember, I'm sure Brian does, and I know you do, that in 2018, there was another spat between Wagner troops and Russian military, where basically Wagner kind of wanted to carry out an attack on American positions. I think it was around the Conoco oil field. And the story kind of it was actually Andrei Martyanov that clarified this the other day. He basically said Wagner went off on their own as a mercenary operation. The states called Russian military command and said, you know, is this anything to do with you? And basically Russia said, no, they're acting on their own. And then, of course, their positions were targeted by US warplanes. The way Wagner kind of played this story, or at least how it was portrayed in Western media, was that the Russian military had betrayed Wagner and led to the deaths of their fighters in Syria. So I think, you know, this entire conflict between Russian military and Prigozhin and PMC goes back as far as that. I do think there was quite possibly some Western interference. I think they saw Prigozhin as a sort of a time bomb that they could possibly exploit. And I would say that the media kind of suggests that they knew what was going on, because the media, again, was copy-paste. Suddenly Prigozhin, who had been criminal number one literally days before, became, you know, the West's ally, or how did Open Democracy put it? basically the West suddenly saw Prigozhin as a bit of a hero, right? Someone that would bring down the Russian government. We all know Anne Applebaum at The Atlantic talking about the Russian Civil War, etc. So I think, I mean, basically, I think it's going to be very hard right now to say exactly who knew what and who was involved. But when we look at the benefits, who are the benefits for? They're for Russia. Whether they manage to reinforce their front lines under the cover of NATO, basically, you know, paying attention to what was going on with Prigozhin, I don't know. I mean, NATO has surveillance systems. They would see what was happening anyway. Putin now has a good idea of who are the fifth columnists within Russia. And I think, Fee, your point about that it's not going away. I mean, I've seen stories here that apparently Syrian security forces are rounding up Wagner in Sweden. I'm like, as far as I know, Wagner was never in Sweden. But okay, let's maintain somehow this facade, right, of this conflict. I'm not quite sure. I think the media at one point lost the script, and they didn't really know where to go. So they ended up then with the whole Putin is weakened. Now they're almost trying to put too much icing on the cake that they kind of very badly baked by coming up with these stories in Syria that you know, Wagner is basically being arrested and security is investigating them in Syria. There's very few Wagner left in Syria. There's very few left in Africa, to my knowledge, because they were all redeployed to Ukraine. I don't know if Brian has any other information on that.
No, I'm not really sure about the numbers and the deployment of Wagner, but I think I agree a lot with what you said, and I didn't even think about that. That is actually a very good point.
Yeah, it was just timing. It was extraordinary, and I only kind of thought about it afterwards because, to a degree, they must have known, because we've been waiting for the Syrian Arab Army to mobilize for months. Why then? Why at that specific point did they suddenly decide to move everything? And as I said, it's not something that you can just do overnight, right? So that to me indicated there was some kind of foreknowledge on Moscow's part of what was going on. You know, am I going to go as far as saying, I know Fee and I discussed this, whether Prigozhin was kind of in on it and he was, I'm probably coming more towards your thinking now, Fee, that he's just a bit of a, you know, he's a bit of a loose cannon that the West probably thought they could exploit and Moscow had greater control over than they realized. That's how I'm kind of reading it now, I think.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you, actually, on that, because everything seems to point out in that direction. Both of you made great points. Another point is that Wagner, of course, was responsible for the great victories for Russia. So it's a very complex situation to deal with, because the one thing that people kept saying is, how is he alive? You know, Putin needs to get rid of Wagner. And so you see a lot of that on Telegram, like, you know, Putin needs to go and kill all these people. Like, you see this emotional, visceral reaction to what's happening, and the fear mongering too by people on Twitter and all these Twitter space people that were talking without knowing absolutely anything. And it was just like, it was just endless and endless. So it was hard to like go through this information, and especially being from the West, that's what I wanted to comment on, is being, I was in the United States when this was happening, and literally everybody was like, oh my gosh, you cannot go back to Russia. This is, oh my God, Russia's falling apart, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I was more scared about not being able to come back in, the US stopping me from coming back in, because, you know, this is my home now. And so I was like, I hope everything's good. And I was checking in with people, and everybody's like, oh yeah, no, Putin will take care of this. And everybody in the newsroom was like, oh yeah, it was like done in a matter of like an hour. And so it was kind of like two different sides, multiple sides, but in the West, you really saw that sense of Russia is falling apart. Now there has been this development though with Prigozhin. Where in the world is Yevgeny Prigozhin? That's what, you know, the world was asking. And of course, Lukashenko said he's not in Belarus, and he was apparently in St. Petersburg, and now they're saying he could be in Moscow. But Oz, if we can just show this tweet, because there was apparently there has been this search, right, of his supposed mansion and his property, and in St. Petersburg, and they found weapons, they found fake passports, and this is almost hilarious to me. I don't know if you found this comedic, but there's like wigs and gold bars and the billions and rubles, but in dollars, and and so it was very interesting, and he had a helicopter pad and an indoor pool, and it was just like I've seen this sort of happen in Latin America where they find like this Latin American leader has been paid off, and they find all this stuff. Like it kind of almost makes me think of Pablo Escobar or something here, like the way it's been put out. So I don't know what to think of this. I think this is almost like comical compared to everything else that we've seen. But Brian, yeah, I want to get your take on what this is. What like it seems like the Russian Federation doesn't really care where Prigozhin is at this point.
Yeah, and I was just talking to Mark Sloboda on a live stream, and he described Prigozhin as a Bond villain. And then when you see those pictures, I mean, it really does look like it's taken right out of a movie or something. I think the point that you made was really important about all of these people screaming for Prigozhin to be killed, for Wagner. They're traitors, kill them all. But if Patrick Lancaster was there in Rostov, and he was on the streets, and he saw the local people that had come out to see the Wagner fighters, and he was interviewing everyone, and everyone was saying, we love Wagner, we love Prigozhin, we love the Ministry of Defense, we love the Russian president, we're glad that it didn't get worse than this. And that if that's the sentiment in Russia, then of course Moscow is not going to kill Prigozhin, and they're not going to come down heavy-handed on the Wagner troops. They're going to resolve it as quickly as possible, and they're going to maintain unity and focus on the actual objective, is this proxy war that NATO, the collective power of NATO, is waging against Russia and Ukraine. And that's exactly what the Kremlin did. And just look at the Western media and this. They made this storm all of their own about how there was I mean, the Civil War article was so absurd. And that it's wishful thinking, really, when you think about it. Maybe we'll talk about the offensive in Ukraine is not going as expected. And so there's a lot of wishful thinking. And I'm shocked. I don't think I should be shocked, but I'm shocked by how emotional and irrational many people across the West are, whether they're journalists or so-called analysts, or policymakers who are drumming up the policy to, carry out this proxy war. It's very scary to see how ill-informed they are, their grasp on reality, how tenuous it is, and how emotional they are. That's scary. And when we talk about Russia doing anything, and for people who have followed the war, the U.S. proxy war in Syria from the beginning, and Russia's reaction to it all along has been without emotion, thinking about long-term victory, and even sacrificing short-term political capital in the process. That is how Russia does things, and that's how they handled this situation.
Yeah. Vanessa, I want to hear your take on this sort of Bond villainess, but also Vanessa, one of the things that Brian just mentioned too is Russia, and I think we've had this conversation before, they're not really great at propaganda. They really, when we think about the West, they do things in reference. The West usually does things in terms of how it's going to be perceived and how they can manipulate a public perception of something. It seems to me Russia just does things, as Brian mentioned, that they need to do. And I think that's what was done in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I do find this quite funny. I don't know who broke this story about the James Bond wigs and the gold bond in the what was it, in the camper van or whatever it was. It almost strikes me as Russia trolling Western media and Western regimes, to be honest. And that's one thing Russia is very good at. It has a really good sense of humor when it comes to kind of taking the mickey out of the West in a very sardonic way. I mean, we've seen RT do it multiple times, and that's what this kind of reminds me of. It's sort of it's so ridiculous. It's almost playing into that entire Western narrative very tongue-in-cheek. I don't know if that's what it is, but that's what it strikes me as. Yeah, you know, the whole, I mean, I love the point that Brian made actually about this emotional, you know, soap drama reaction that you get in the West. War is a video game for the majority of commentators on Twitter and on social media. You know, they have no comprehension of what war really means. And those of us who've been there and actually seen firsthand the effects of war, it's not something that you want to instigate, as the West does, of course, all of the time. And Russia is not like this, as Brian said. In Syria, they have made decisions, cold, hard decisions, that have been painful, both for Syrian Arab Army and for Russian military at times, and for their political diplomatic relations in the region, right? So Russia is a lot more hard-nosed and realistic, rational in its decisions and in its long-term strategy. And so, yeah, I think with the Prigozhin issue, maybe he is going to pop up somewhere else. Maybe he does have, you know, a kind of compensatory, lucrative contract waiting for him somewhere else in the world. I really don't know. But from a PR perspective, Putin handled this absolutely perfectly, as far as I'm concerned. And as a result, I mean, you know, again, we can see how the West is projecting. It's projecting that Putin is weakened, when in reality, the West has been weakened even by this attempted coup, whoever was behind it. Right? The West is left weakened. It's left looking ridiculous. The media is yet further discredited. Putin has a far better handle on the opposition within the Ministry of Defense, within the government, even within the public to some extent, right? So he's in a much stronger position than he was before the Prigozhin event. Yeah, I think a lot of these stories are going to keep sort of trickling out. How much of them are realistic or true, I really have no idea. It's very difficult to figure that out right now, because I think also we know that on Telegram, for example, there's a huge number of accounts that are spreading disinformation for whatever reason. Either they're working for Kiev while presenting themselves as being pro-Russia accounts, so they're deliberately dropping disinformation into their narratives and into their information. So it's, you know, it's going to be very difficult. And I think we also have to focus on the strategy, the overall strategy, and what the aims of Russia are and what the aims of NATO are, and not get distracted by some of this disinformation that's going to be sown in order to do exactly that.
Yeah, and that word disinformation, I hate using it because it's what the establishment used for every single thing, whether it was COVID, whether it was elections, but it is true. There is actual disinformation out there. I'm not saying censor people, but I am saying it's there, and people are absorbing it. Now, I do want to talk about the actual operation, because unfortunately, it seems like we're all on edge to a degree, because the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has been manipulated by the West as a false flag of Russia against Ukraine, when we know, of course, the ones who have been the experts in actually executing false flags are the United States and their NATO allies. We know this, of course, with the Kakhovka Dam, with the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. We could go on and on throughout history of all the false flags that have happened. Now, this was, of course, manipulated right after, the timing, right after this Prigozhin scenario fell flat on its face. But today there were a few explosions seen in Zaporozhye. If that nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Europe, were to explode, were to actually be attacked, and I don't put it past NATO to do that, to try to prove a point, it would be catastrophic for everybody, including Ukraine, including in nearby Belarus. So again, I'll go back to you, Brian. Do you think that is a possibility, or do you think it's just another chest puffing by the West? And what do you make of that latest sort of pivot to Zaporozhye, Zaporozhye, Zaporozhye?
Well, I'm very glad that I was just talking to Mark Sloboda before this live stream, because he actually was a nuclear reactor operator in the U.S. Navy, and he was talking about the construction of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and how well constructed it is and how difficult it will be to create some sort of actual disaster there. However, staging some sort of disaster, well, now that is something that the U.S. and their proxies are very good at, and they've done that over the years. And we remember the 2003 invasion of Iraq, predicated on deliberately falsified claims of weapons of mass destruction. Then in Syria, as the Syrian Arab Army was taking back Douma, it was just, I think, just days before they secured that neighborhood, the U.S. proxies staged a chemical attack there. And they did that as, I believe, a UN delegation was on its way or already there. And they set it up so perfectly to frame Syria, even though it made no sense. To people paying attention, it made no sense. But to the general public, they continuously heard how the Syrian government is losing, the rebels are winning, and they staged this. They're using chemical weapons because they're desperate. And we see the same narrative playing out in Ukraine, where we see people who are paying attention see the Ukrainian offensive failing. We see Russia, even the Western media, admitting that Russian defenses are much more formidable than had been anticipated, although I don't know why they didn't anticipate it. And so now they're timing all of this just as the NATO summit is coming up. All of this is coming together just like it did in Syria. So I'm highly suspicious of all of this rhetoric. The narrative that Kiev is putting together is so well crafted to frame Russia. I mean, they're doing absolutely everything to ramp up the fear, to ramp up the narrative, to frame Russia. So I think Russia has experienced this in Syria many times. There were many cases where Russia would warn the world there's another stage provocation coming. They used their media to try to get the word out to the world. And then ultimately these provocations were either they backed off of them or they fell flat whenever they tried to carry them out. And so I'm guessing that is something that Russia is trying to do now, to kind of preempt this, get the information out there and preempt it and kind of scare them off of even trying to do this.
Yeah, Vanessa, he mentioned Syria. Do you also see those similarities as to what we're seeing now in Zaporozhye?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had it throughout the SMO since February 2022. We had Bakhmut, we had the mass graves, which Eva Bartlett completely discredited from on the ground almost immediately in Mariupol. As you've mentioned, all the various other sabotage operations that have then been blamed on Russia. And I think for me, the first point that I always make here is that back in November, when I went to Donbass to witness or to observe the referendum, I was speaking to Russian officials and diplomats and just ordinary people, and all of them were kind of shrugging off the idea that the West would take it as far as a nuclear false flag of any description, or take it to a nuclear war. They were literally blasé about it. They were like, don't be ridiculous, it's not going to happen, it's just not going to happen. Now there's a complete reversal of that, and all of my Russian contacts, even here in Syria, are seriously concerned. They're really worried, and as Brian said, they're not worried about the security of Zaporozhye because they've taken care of that. What they're worried about, and I think it was a representative, I think his name is Koshar, from the Atomic Energy Institution in Russia, talking about them having intelligence information that Ukraine was going to basically fire a missile that had radiological warheads, radiological matter taken from a nuclear plant in the south of Ukraine. Now, the fact that someone as serious as this was putting this out as a warning, as Brian said, this is clearly Russia trying to kind of put a pin in the NATO balloon before it can actually burst and destroy not only Western Ukraine, but Western Europe, depending on where the wind is blowing. Professor Chris Busby, another radiological expert who covered the use of DU in Fallujah, in particular in Iraq, he was talking about a radiological surveillance plane that had taken off from the UK and landed in Crete in Greece. So there is a degree of preparation for something. And Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who in my view is a complete idiot, but who was responsible for much of the chemical weapon narratives in Syria, including the ridiculous idea that your fridge could turn itself into a bomb in your house, which was, debunked by just about everyone immediately, was on, I think it was the Times interview talking about, the evil and deranged Putin is basically about to blow up the Zaporozhye plant and contaminate half of Europe. And this, to me, when they wheel out someone like him, who clearly has affiliations to MI6, who is clearly being facilitated and given a platform by media that is affiliated to British intelligence services, then you have to be aware that, yes, they are still trying, they will still try to find a way. Everything has failed so far. The counteroffensive is failing. As many weapons as NATO pours into Ukraine, they're failing, right? I mean, the US is now talking about cluster bombs that they should have stopped manufacturing back in 2016. Now Biden's bypassed whatever law and legislation to send allegedly stocks of cluster bombs to Ukraine. So they're desperate, but in desperation, they are dangerous, I think. It's not Russia. We're not talking about Russia. We're not talking about China. We know the West is effectively unhinged. It has no problem depopulating Ukraine for its agenda.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the cluster munitions, because that's really what I wanted to turn to, is the state of the counteroffensive. It obviously, Ukraine is not doing well by all accounts. I mean, and Zelensky has been crying to Belarus. He's been crying to the entirety of NATO. As Brian, you mentioned, the NATO summit is coming up. And it seems like Ukraine isn't going to get any of what it wants in terms of it becoming a full-fledged member of the NATO alliance. And everybody is basically saying, we don't want that. We don't have enough security guarantees from Ukraine. And so that's not working out for them either, because of their failure on the battlefield. Clearly, there is, I don't know. It almost felt like it was like a carrot that was being dangled on Ukraine. I never thought they were actually going to do it. But now it seems ever further away from ever happening. What are we looking at here when it comes to the state of this conflict? Because they're not going to be a part of NATO. Zelensky is angry that he's not getting his way when it comes to NATO, when it comes to more weapons, even though, as Vanessa just mentioned, the Biden administration just approved cluster munitions. They're giving $800 million more in aid. But I mean, all of this, of course, it seems to be a sort of veneer to distract from the fact that they are failing.
Well, the cluster munitions specifically are 155 millimeter artillery shells, and they are sending these cluster munitions to Ukraine because they are out of conventional artillery shells. And this has always been a problem that Ukraine has had since the special military operation began, since they began running out of their own Soviet-era artillery systems and shells, and NATO began transferring theirs. Everyone who is familiar with NATO logistics knew, and military industrial output knew, that they had no way of sustaining this scale of operation. And now we see the outcome of that. They're in the middle of this intense offensive. They need more shells now than ever. They have been at it for a month now. They have not even gotten through the security zone, let alone the layered defenses that await them, that Russia has prepared for over half a year. And so now they're sending these cluster munitions. This is an admission, whether they want to actually admit it or not, that they are out of options and they are desperate. They are desperate to try to kick the can down the road as far as possible. Now, regarding Ukraine getting into NATO, I don't even think they're legally allowed to enter NATO if they're in the middle of a conflict. I don't think that that's even possible. And they're not even talking about inviting Ukraine into NATO and discussing any timeline at all. So it really is, if you could imagine someone sitting on Ukraine as a donkey and holding the carrot, and they're is trying to reach that carrot, and it just keeps walking and walking and walking until it exhausts itself and dies. I mean, that's basically what NATO is doing to Ukraine. It's very sad because there's human beings dying by the thousands now during this offensive that they had to know was going to. They had to know that this was going to fail. The New York Times was reporting back in December last year that Russia was creating extensive defense lines. They had pictures of it, satellite images, diagrams, and they only created more extensive fortifications since then. So what did they expect to happen with the limited amount of equipment, the limited amount of time they had for training? This was always going to end this way. So it's very hard to tell what their end game is, if they even have one. NATO and the United States, look what they did in Afghanistan. For 20 years, they just kept kicking the can down the road. They had no plan. And so I think that the stakes are much higher now in Ukraine. But I think that at this point, they still don't have a really concrete plan of what to do and how to go forward.
Yeah, Vanessa, where do you think this is going? I mean, we've seen, it seems, as Brian mentioned, that these last attempts with NATO and by NATO in Ukraine are very desperate, desperate to distract, desperate to cover up their failures. And these munitions, of course, show that, but also the fact that you're seeing the political side where they're not even giving any sort of credence to this idea that Ukraine will be a part of NATO. As Brian mentioned, yeah, they're not allowed to be, but this has been something that has been talked about as a matter of fact. And now with this NATO summit and other summits coming up, it seems like the overwhelming majority of even Europe is pulling away to a degree. So where are we in this conflict?
Well, I think, the cluster bomb issue has horrendous ramifications for civilians in Donbass. One of the reasons, and of course, one of the reasons they allegedly stopped manufacture in 2016 was because of uproar about the use of cluster munitions, US manufactured cluster munitions by Saudi Arabia against Yemeni civilian targets, where they had something like between a 30 and a 40% failure rate, which means that the cluster bomblets didn't explode on impact and therefore could be picked up by children as toys and so on, and would then explode. And the norm was supposed to be, I think, a 1% failure rate, which of course the States has failed dismally to meet. So for me, although, yes, on the one hand, it demonstrates that NATO is running out of options, it also means increased misery for the civilians in Donbass, because these are the munitions that are going to be used against civilian targets, markets, schools, hospitals in Donbass from here on in as soon as they arrive. And that, that for me is just absolutely horrendous. I think, one of the issues, of course, with the Zaporozhye false flag is that then they can invoke Article 5, and is there potential for, we know that NATO's already on the ground. All of these weapons couldn't possibly, as far as I understand, Brian, I don't know if you agree, but many of the weapons that are coming in could not, the Ukrainians couldn't be trained quickly enough to actually use them. There has to be, well, we know there are both NATO mercenaries and NATO military already on the ground in Ukraine. Are they going to bring Polish forces forward to kind of fill the breach that has been left by the thousands of massacred Ukrainians that NATO has been sending to their death? That's another option, I guess. They could just keep pouring, more European sacrificial lambs into the battle. And that could also be why Europe is starting to back off and starting to say, actually, I'm not sure we want to kind of throw ourselves on the US sword as part of NATO, because it's not, this isn't in EU countries' interest to continue this war. It's only really in the UK and US interest. So effectively, they've created a quagmire, and while assuming that they're going to create that quagmire for Russia, they've actually created it for themselves. And I can't see where else they're going to get weapons from. Israel is making these big claims it's not going to send the Iron Dome system in case it falls into the hands of Iran. But in my view, it's because the Iron Dome system has failed dismally against even Gazan rockets. So the last thing they want to do is for Israel to send that to Ukraine and for it to get tested by Russian hypersonic missiles and be shown all its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And that's what, of course, what we're seeing as regards NATO. We're seeing their Achilles heels. We're seeing them being demonstrated to be a far weaker military power than they have been portraying themselves for decades now.
Yeah, and we've been talking about the potential disaster with nuclear war, with the explosion of the Zaporozhye, with the cluster munitions, but also on the front of that's the political front. Ukraine is also losing very badly. I do want to show this tweet that I did put up recently, because this just came out, that 33 leaders of Latin America and the Caribbean decided to persuade the EU, and they were able to reject Vladimir Zelensky's invitation to the upcoming EU CELAC summit on July 17th and 18th. And they also were able to remove all paragraphs that said support for Ukraine. This signals to me something in terms of this multipolar shift we're seeing, especially in the global south, more so in the global south than anywhere, and obviously in the east with China, with the upcoming Russia-Africa summit. We're seeing a lot of these conversations being had with Mercosur and the creation also of a potential transitioning away from the dollar and SWIFT, and all of that happening also on the background to where Ukraine is obviously not proving itself in the battlefield. And even if people were ideologically with Ukraine, it's as you mentioned, Vanessa, it's not convenient. And you, Brian, as well, it's not convenient anymore for the EU and others to really go along with what is happening. So my question to you is this a conflict that has the potential, because this has been the debate, to be resolved in any sort of negotiation? Or is this a conflict that will be determined, in spite of everything else, on the battlefield only, because of the inability of the United States and Ukraine and NATO proxies to really sit down and have a fair negotiation with Russia? Because Russia has tried at every turn to negotiate, but that has never happened. So, Brian, I guess I'll start with you.
I think it's going to be mainly settled on the battlefield, just like the U.S. proxy war in Syria. A lot of people were talking about negotiations, and we look at how long that conflict dragged out, and it's still ongoing right now. The U.S. still illegally occupies eastern Syria. But if we look at the situation now in Syria, the patience of Russia, the Syrians, their allies, the Iranians, everyone else who has gotten involved, look at the situation now for the United States. They're isolated. What they're doing is unsustainable. And all of these other factors that you just talked about, the rise of multipolarism, that has played a role. We see what happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, this peace brokered by China, and how that is changing the dynamics in the region and creating a more precarious situation for the United States in Syria. We're looking at how it's being solved on the battlefield in Syria, but these external factors serve as a ticking clock, and the time is running out for the United States. In Syria, I believe time is running out for the United States and its proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, and I believe time is running out for its planned, provoked conflict with China. And they understand this. And this is why they're rushing. And this is why when you rush, you make bad decisions, you make mistakes, you get sloppy. And most certainly Washington and their foreign policy, I think, has never been so desperate, but also never has it been so dangerous. So I think that, yes, it has to be solved on the battlefields and with these external factors that are out of America's control, because they're never going to voluntarily come to the negotiation table and negotiate in good faith. And none of their proxies in the European Union will do so either.
Vanessa, you're in Syria, right? How are you looking at this in terms of your experience and how the United States has obviously interfered and continues to interfere in Syria? How do you look at this conflict having any sort of resolution?
Well, we know that historically the US only gets out when it starts to become very difficult for them to stay. And of course, what is going on now in Syria is a kind of guerrilla warfare by the tribal factions in the northeast against American positions, and it's relatively successful. And the thing is that once American publics start to, because the reason they switched, of course, to these proxy wars is to maintain public support for their military adventurism, because Iraq became a problem because there were too many young Americans being sent back in body bags. When an ISIS terrorist dies, or Al Qaeda or Jaish al-Islam or any of these, no one really cares. When the Nazis in Ukraine are being slaughtered by Russia in a proxy war, no one really pays much attention other than to follow the media, dehumanize Russians, and support the war effort. But when actual American soldiers start coming back in casques, that's when it becomes untenable for the United States. And so what I'm trying to say is the States only understands force. It doesn't understand anything else. It doesn't understand what negotiation means unless it's bullying, unless it's their rules-based governance. In other words, everyone has to comply with the US agenda. And I think you hit on something very important, that the EU is starting to realize that this is not to its benefit. Many of the EU countries have good relationships with Russia, even France. And why are you seeing the uptick in violence in France suddenly? It's basically, in my opinion, a Gladio operation. There have been ongoing protests against Macron since 2019. The media has paid absolutely no attention. Now, suddenly, we've got car bombs, we've got guns coming in, we've got kind of, in my opinion, again, far-right factions committing violent acts and then blaming them on the migrants to basically start, sorry, the dogs are kicking off now, to start, a civil war. It's a Gladio operation. Why? Because France for a long time has been a thorn in the side of US supremacy within NATO. And France has good relations with Russia. Macron has good relations with Russia. I don't know if people remember the scandal of his security officer, Benalla, who was being paid millions by Macron to provide security for some of the oligarchs closest to Putin. I think it was back in 2016. So I think EU countries are now starting to feel the heat, and they're wanting to back away. And so what the States is going to do is to instigate pressure or destabilization there, in my opinion, to try and bring them back into line. And I think Brian's absolutely right. The US right now and its close allies are at their most dangerous because it's all slipping away from them, basically.
Yeah, it's like an animal that's injured, right? And is lashing out at everybody because it's in pain and it knows it's dying, essentially. And that's the way I'm also looking at this conflict. I want to thank you both for coming on. If you wanted to say any last words, anything you're working on, anything that you have coming up, please let the audience know. This was a wonderful discussion, and I hope to have many more discussions like this. Brian and Vanessa, both of you, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I guess just to announce, I will be joining Vanessa on her channel next week, Thursday, And I will be posting it on my platform. So everyone, if you're following the New Atlas on YouTube or on Telegram, I will post that, and so people can catch me there.
Awesome. Yeah, the same. I'm looking forward to that. We're going to be discussing the Russian role in Syria and how people misrepresent it and get very emotional about why Russia's not doing more, etc., and try and kind of temper it down and bring in some military perspective to it. So it should be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to it. But people can follow my stuff at Substack, on Telegram. I'm still hanging on to Twitter and YouTube, but Substack and Telegram are the main ones.
All right, so make sure to check that out, everyone, coming up next week. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Have a good weekend. I'm out. Bye.